Oh, whoa. Wow. Do. All right. More people are here. Let's let everyone in. Hi, everyone. What a rainy day we have. The weather just doesn't know what it wants to do, does it? One day snow, one day sun, one day rain. Fun. Yeah. I'm really looking forward to summer. Normally, I don't mind winter. But I guess, I don't know if it was because it was my second COVID winter, the second winter that had my social life limited due to the coronavirus situation. I guess I'm just sick and tired of winter now. But did everybody hear the new geez, what do they call it? Well, it was announcement. It was an announcement, a recent announcement from Carleton for summer courses and the COVID policies heading into summer courses. And it looks like, fingers crossed, as long as nothing crazy happens, it looks like we will be able to do in-person stuff. Masks will be optional but recommended. And that'll be really nice. I can't wait to teach in person and see everybody. I've only got my one in-person class right now, and more than half of the students still join from online. So it feels weird, but I can't wait for summer. I hope you guys are also looking forward to summer and that you're glad to hear about those recent announcements. One other announcement that I'm not entirely sure how this happened. I guess it was when I was setting up the course. But for some reason, I was under the impression that the 6th was our last day of class. The last day of class is actually the 12th. So we actually have we have one more lecture than I thought we did. So what I did, even though we had a sort of a vote and discussion last time, what I did is I figured, since we had more time than I thought, we can cover all of the rest of the chapter on women, feminism, and technology. And then we'll cover the anti-technology chapter over the last 2 lectures. So I'm glad that, I mean, I'm not, again, I think it was just when I was inputting my schedule into my phone when I was setting up Brightspace for the class and getting all the modules up and running. I must have just forgotten about one of the classes, or just had the days wrong. So anyway, nice little happy mistake there. So let's share the screen, and hopefully my laptop isn't too slow today, and we can talk about the final section of women, feminism, and technology. So last time, if you'll recall, we were talking about the nature, the science, technology, nature metaphors, which were as follows. Science and technology are thought of as male on this metaphor. Science and technology are male, because males are supposed to be stereotypically, I suppose, detached, rational, less emotional, more objective, dominating, controlling, right? When we say technology is male, we mean something like what Bacon had in mind. Remember Bacon's really creepy, like, oh, you have to seduce nature. Bacon uses this sort of, I think it's rapey. It's like, and Dusek agrees. He says this quote, a lot of people feel this, I think Dusek's exact words are, this borders on date rape. It is incredibly creepy. So that's like the extreme version of the male metaphor for science and technology. And stereotypically, women, of course, were seen as more associated with nature. because, again, stereotypically, women are supposed to be more emotional, more cooperative, and that kind of thing, right? So that's the metaphor. And where we left off was, kind of asking whether this is a metaphor or if it's just a metaphor, or if there really are some kind of essential male and female characteristics, and whether there are also essential characteristics of science and technology or nature that that explains why we apply this metaphor. In other words, is it just a metaphor, or is it pointing us towards something that's really there, some true essential nature stuff? Even if it's just a metaphor, it could still affect how we do science and technology, right? Because metaphors are one of the ways in which we think about ourselves. If this metaphor is a way in which we actually think about men and women and science and technology, then arguably, even if it's just a metaphor, it could still have an effect on women in technology, certainly. So, and these themes will continue today, where if I can get there's my mouse. Okay. These themes continue today, where we will talk about the final section, which is entitled Variant Feminist Approaches to Theory of Knowledge in Changing Science and Technology. So we're going to be getting a little epistemological here. Remember, epistemology is a branch of philosophy that deals with theory of knowledge. But we're not just going to be doing epistemology. We're also continuing to ask, questions to do with this sort of gender essentialism, right? And I'm going to be riffing it a little bit too. This is a riffy lecture, so just be warned. Let's start off with how Dusek opens this chapter. Dusek writes that, quote, Sandra Harding, in her 1986 book, classified approaches to science in a way that has relevance to technology as well. The position closest to the traditional and widespread theory of scientific knowledge is feminist empiricism. Feminist empiricism aims to reform science and its technological applications, for instance, in medicine, by correcting bad science. It accepts standard empiricist or even positivist accounts of the nature of scientific knowledge, claiming that what is wrong is simply bad science and false claims about women. And I find this pretty interesting. Although I'm not overly familiar with feminist philosophy, I mean, I do think of myself in the everyday sense as a feminist, or I try to be a good feminist, which means equality of the sexes on my sort of outlook and on most feminists' outlook. We could define feminism that way. So I'm not too familiar with feminist scholarship, though. I mean, I know the big names, but I was kind of pleased to learn about feminist empiricism a little while ago when I was first reading this chapter. And it struck me as very interesting because while maybe more radical approaches, more radical versions of feminism, like postmodern, some postmodern strains maybe, as we'll see later, deny that there are any essential, and there's anything essential about gender, right? It's all a social construction. Feminist empiricism is kind of different from that extreme version. Feminist empiricism sort of accepts science and technology, but wants to correct, wants to correct it when we do it poorly, right? So I don't think a feminist empiricist would necessarily agree that science is inherently male, but they would certainly say that, for example, there is sexism in the sciences. There is a lack of representation of women in STEM, right? They would certainly agree with that. And they would also, and this is the empiricism part, they want to focus in on and correct bad science, science that comes up with findings that are not representative of the way reality is, and which are that way because of either some kind of institutional sexism or bad science about women, right? And Dusek has a number of examples that we can iterate through here of this sort of bad science. And this is kind of why I like this. I don't know. I think there really is something to the metaphor, I suppose, of science and technology being stereotypically male, whether they're essentially male or males have this sort of essential like alpha male kind of dominate and control thing, or whether that is a social construction. I don't know. But I think that this stuff here, there's some aspects of the more radical side of feminism, feminist philosophy of science, where I suppose what I'm saying is I'm a bit more agnostic. But here, I certainly agree with the approaches of feminist empiricism in correcting bad science, which has a lot to do with bad biological theories concerning women, particularly their intelligence or their motivation. There certainly is a lot of bad science out there that still needs correcting. And with my background, which is kind of as also a scientist, as well as a philosopher, I don't know, I guess I just feel a bit of affinity for feminist empiricism. So yeah, a lot of this is to do with bad biology, really. The Feminist Empiricist Project aims at correcting a lot of this. One example, of course, that has to do with women's intelligence is the claim that women lack the abstract reasoning abilities that men have, and that women are more emotional. This is one claim that's supposed to explain their lack of representation in science and technology. And note well, I think this is probably absolutely wrong. There's been all sorts of junk science. This kind of comes out of the same sort of bad science tradition as stuff like phrenology, right? Let's stop and talk about that for a minute. Does anybody remember, well, it's not like you were there in the 19th century, but is anybody familiar with phrenology? Phrenology was championed by a man named Franz Joseph Gall. If I said to you, imagine a representation of a human head with different areas on the skull sort of traced out and numbered, would that ring a bell to any of you? Really? Anyone in the chat? No? Oh, well, maybe somebody's typing right now, but I'll go ahead and start explaining. Phrenology was the idea that you could read things like personality traits off of the skull, off of the shape of a skull, right? And it was used to motivate a lot of scientific racialism and scientific sexism. So, for example, and when I say personality traits, I don't mean like the personality traits you'll hear about in psychology now. Like if you take a psychology class on personality, you'll learn about traits like conscientiousness or openness to new experiences or neuroticism, right? These are character traits or personality traits in psychology now. But back in Gall's day, personality traits included things like criminality or wanderlust, right? And what you ended up with is a scientific enterprise that was very, very unscientific, in fact, because first of all, there was no basis for the claims of phrenology. Personality traits like criminality cannot be read off of the shape of one's skull, but these were used to argue things like racist stuff, like, oh, Europeans are morally better, other races are more disposed to crime, simply because of the shape of the skull, right? Which also, by the way, there's really not that much significant variation in skull shape between different ethnic groups. There's less genetic diversity in the entire human race than there are in, for example, like different troops of chimpanzees. And that's because the human race has been through repeated population bottlenecks over the years. Yeah, it was very pseudoscientific, absolutely. And another claim that would have come out of this would because there are gender differences in the shapes of skulls. The female skulls tend to be more gracile, whereas males tend to be more robust. So there is a biological difference there in terms of bone structure. That's real, but that was used to argue that women must have smaller brains and therefore not be as smart, which is not true. In fact, women, I believe, do have a little bit larger of a brain to body mass ratio than men. So yeah, turns out actually the opposite is true. Caitlin says, yeah, we talk about phrenology in some neuroscience classes and yeah, we laugh now because it seems so silly. But we have to remember that, you know, people actually believed this stuff. And they were saying like, oh, little Johnny's got a case of wanderlust because area number 10 is too pronounced. Like, that's why Johnny wants to go travel around the world instead of staying home and having a family. This is real stuff. It's crazy. Nowadays, you know, and this is where Dusek picks up. You know, nowadays it's all about this men are more reasonable and women are more emotional, which also, I mean, have you been around men and women recently? I've seen a lot of emotional men, like super emotional men. Maybe they're emotional in different ways than women, but emotional nonetheless. I remember the sexist comments of Donald Trump, right, before his presidency and when he was president, and well, hell, actually all the time. Donald Trump is just sexist all the time, really, when you get down to it. But Trump and a lot of his supporters were like, oh, you can't, you know, we can't have Hillary be the president in the run up to the election. A lot of the Fox News narrative was like, do we want a woman president? Because women are emotional. But like, Trump is one of the most emotional public figures that you could possibly find. So yeah. And is he rational? Well, certainly not. Oh, great example, Julian. Yeah. Anyone see the Oscars? If you did, well, you probably have heard about what happened anyway. Even if you didn't watch, I usually don't watch award shows, but I watched the Oscars, and holy moly, Will Smith, what? He smacked Chris Rock, right? Because Chris Rock made a joke about Jada Pinkett Smith's hair, right? He made that G.I. Jane joke, which was, yeah, I mean, that was in poor taste for sure. Like, because Jada Pinkett Smith was dealing with hair loss because of alopecia, right? Which is a medical condition. It's not like she decided just to be bald. I guess this upset Will, and he smacked Chris Rock on live television and then yelled at him, you know, keep my wife's name out of your effing mouth, I believe is what he said. So yeah, men can be emotional. Women can be rational. I mean, come on. Some of the smartest people I know, the smartest profs, are women. My master supervisor, woman, very smart, head of her field. I was just like so glad I get to be supervised by this person, right? Mad respect. So it's just not true that on the whole, men are rational and good at abstracting and women are more emotional. It's just not true. Men and women are both. Men and women may express their emotions in different ways, and some of that may have to do with a little bit of biology and a little bit of culture, and it's very, very complicated. But nonetheless, come on, we get the point, right? Further, it was claimed that women were right-brained and men were left-brained. A little bit about the brain. You know, the brain is divided into two cerebral hemispheres. So, of course, if you're taking a neuroscience course, you'll know this already. But in case you're not, we have a left brain and a right brain. And it was thought that the right brain was the locus of like more intuitive, creative thinking. And the left was the locus of language and reason. I guess that's the way it looks in most right-handed people, right? We have to remember that left-handed people tends to be the opposite. Their brains are like mirrors of right-handed people. So people would say, oh, women are more emotional. They must be right-brained because the right brain is this sort of non-linguistic, creative artist brain sort of thing. But that's a gross oversimplification. It's true that language centers in most people are on the left hemisphere. You're talking like Broca's area and Wernicke's area. But these are only a small part of the whole language system. And, you know, everybody's different. So, okay, maybe women are right-brained and men are left-brained. So they're all about language and logic, those men. But when we look at how children develop, young girls' language development usually outstrips boys. They start talking a little bit earlier, and they pick up words faster. So at least for the start, women are actually better with words, even though it was claimed they're right-brained. I don't really think anybody is right, or sorry, my cat distracted. I think it's kind of weird to say that people are right or left-brained. We do, after all, use the entirety of our brains. Saying somebody's right or left brain kind of sounds to me like that, oh, you only use 10% of your brain myth. This is not true. Your entire brain is active all the freaking time, even when you're asleep, you know. Sorry, my dog's barking. Now, oh boy. Oh, okay, there we go. I thought the slide hadn't flipped, but there it goes. So the story changed once sociobiologists and developmental psychologists saw that women, or rather girls, language learning abilities outstripped those of boys. It was claimed later that women are actually left-brained. They're skilled in language, but will use this against their abstract reasoning abilities, right? So the story went, women are right-brained. Oh, but girls learn language faster and better than boys. Oh, well, women must actually be left-brained. But they're still not good at reasoning abstractly. I mean, come on. This is so terrible. Dusek writes, it is claimed that mathematical, spatial, and geometrical skills are associated with the right brain, and that boys are right-brained with superior spatial skills. This neglects purely linguistic and non-spatial areas of math, as in logic and computer science, right? Where we would assume that women, if they are left-brained, would excel. So it's even been claimed that there's a math gene. And whenever a claim like this happens, you should be very skeptical. This must have come out of the 90s. I remember, I mean, high school biology, I think we had just recently cracked the human genome when I was in high school biology. And around that time, I did enjoy reading a lot of popular science books, and a lot of them had to do with genetics. But genes really were all the rage. You know, a few years earlier, there was Dolly the sheep. We had cloned a sheep for the first time, right? We cracked the human genome. The Human Genome Project was a success. So it was all about genes. People were talking like, there's genes for this, genes for that, right? But these are very overblown. I read a book by Dean Hamer. It's called The God Gene. Oh, sounds pretty crazy, right? The God Gene. The subtitle of this book was How Faith is Hardwired into Our Genes. I saw this book in the bookstore and I thought, I'm an atheist. You know, I am. I still am. And I'm an atheist. I'm not a religious person. I would be like what Antony Flew called a weak atheist, right? So I'm in there and I'm going to buy this book. So I'm like, oh, there's a God gene, is there? Maybe I don't have that. Maybe that's why I'm an atheist, right? I'm reading this book, and this gene is it's a gene called VMAT2, and all it does is code for serotonin production. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that's implicated in the brain with feelings of happiness. For example, if you suffer from depression or anxiety, you may be prescribed selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. What these do is they kind of latch onto receptor sites and slow the reuptake of serotonin into the synapse so that there's more serotonin floating around in your synapse. And these are pretty effective for mild to moderate depression and for anxiety. Now, so serotonin, however, is also implicated in peak experiences and spiritual experiences, which is why Hamer, I guess, calls this the God gene. But serotonin is also found in the gut. It regulates digestive processes. So you could have just as easily called this book the gut gene, right? Or the happiness gene, or this is not a God gene. This is a gene that codes for the mechanisms that help us to make a neurotransmitter that does a lot of different things. So this popular science at the time was pretty bad, and I think this math gene claim falls in with that bunch. I also like to draw your attention to some more possibly bad science here from Simon Baron-Cohen. Now, Simon Baron-Cohen is a pretty famous scientist. I'm not trying to say he's a bad scientist, but I disagree with his theory of autism. So Simon Baron-Cohen, I believe, is at Cambridge. He's actually Sacha Baron Cohen's cousin, right? Borat, Ali G, the dictator, you know Sacha Baron Cohen. So his cousin is a famous psychologist, Simon Baron-Cohen. And he researches autism, and his theory of autism is that it's a deficit in theory of mind, right? The inability to mind read. And he has a book called Mind Blindness that you can read about. And he links this to overexposure to testosterone in the womb, which may affect the development of the brain, such that we end up with two different categories of brains. We can have people with E brains, or empathizing brains, or people with S brains, or systematizing brains. This is kind of an essentialist theory, because one of the underlying assumptions is that women tend to have E brains, empathy brains, right? Good at theory of mind, good at compassion, good at understanding their own emotions and others' emotions. Whereas men have S brains, good for systematizing, right? And his theory of autism is that whether you're male or female, exposure to too much testosterone during your development might cause you to develop a super duper S brain, which he takes as the autistic brain. I think this is probably wrong. I'm trying to be charitable because I don't have anything on Simon Baron-Cohen. He's a big famous scientist from Cambridge, but there are some pretty problematic essentialist assumptions here. And I remember my professor, who I mentioned before, her name was Heidi Maybaum. Well, it still is Heidi Maybaum. She's at the University of Cincinnati now, and she studies psychopathy and empathy and a little bit about autism, and she knows about this stuff. And told me once in an empathy seminar that she took a test designed by Baron-Cohen and his team to tell you what kind of brain you had. So, okay, what kind of brain do I have? Takes the test. Turns out Heidi had an E brain and an S brain together, right? Good at empathy, but also good at systematizing things, which makes sense because, you know, she's a professor of philosophy. So Are there like E brains and S brains? Are there male and female brains? There are some anatomical differences between male and female brains. But those are very overblown. And the fact of the matter is that we're learning now that autism, you know, another assumption that Baron Cohen was led to here, or ostensibly a finding he was led to, was that autism is much more common in boys than it is in girls. This is usually identified when you're young. There are some adults, you know, that learn to kind of like get by, you know, like your adults with Asperger's kind of people, right? But the assumption was that autism affected men and boys more than girls and women. But it turns out that autism, like ADHD, just expresses itself differently in girls. So, you know, this E-brain, S-brain thing probably doesn't explain autism, but it is an example of this sort of, I want to say, poorly executed biology, right? And again, I'm really not trying to be uncharitable. Simon Baron-Cohen is like a legend in autism research, but I think this early theory of his is probably not correct. I disagree with it. It's also been claimed, thanks to recent findings, that women have greater connective tissue between their two cerebral hemispheres. So this has actually motivated another claim that women are less able to separate reason and emotion. God, bad neuroscience. Yes, it's true that women may have better connectivity between the hemispheres. They have really great corpus callosums, right? Your corpus callosum is like the bridge between your two cerebral hemispheres. But does that mean that women are less able to separate reason and emotion? I don't think so. Because again, emotion, it's not like the right side of the brain is the emotional side of the brain. Emotions involve emotional responses recruit parts of the brain, you know, all kinds of parts of the brain. It also depends on what kind of emotions we're talking about, right? If we're talking about rudimentary emotions, that's all lizard brain stuff. By lizard brain, I mean the parts of the brain that are shared with animals that are further down on that evolutionary family tree. Reptiles. Reptiles don't have a neocortex. Mammals do. But reptiles and mammals both have a limbic system. So that's your lizard brain. You know, the amygdala, part of the limbic system, is implicated in fear and in aggression, you know, in rudimentary negative emotions. And it's not like we've only got one on one side, right? The brain is contralaterally organized, which means you have a mirror of both cerebral hemispheres, and the right hemisphere generally deals with inputs and outputs from the left side of space and vice versa. So does a better set of connections between your two cerebral hemispheres mean you're less able to separate reason and emotion? No, I don't think so. And by the way, this is true of all neuroscience. Studies like these are based on incredibly small sample sizes. We're talking about dozens of people, right? If you do a poll, imagine you're like a pollster and you want to do a poll for, say there's an election coming up. You probably ask like 1,000 to 1,500 people. You probably survey that many people. That's your sample size. If you're doing a psychology study, you want to get at least 50 people. It would be great to have a few hundred. In neuroscience, because, you know, running that fMRI machine, that's expensive. You might get 12 people. And, you know, the small sample sizes means we have to be conservative about the claims that we make based on the results we observe. Because it could just be a weird result of random circumstance that you got the sample size that you did, which maybe all the women in your sample size just happen to have like overdeveloped corpus callosums or something, right? It's not out of the question. Stranger things have happened. This is why we want to have the right sample size, do the experiment properly, right? But in neuroscience, this is difficult to do because it's very expensive to operate the machinery that you need to do these kinds of studies. In neuroscience, we rely a lot on meta-analyses to try and overcompensate for this, you know, an analysis that is of many different studies that ask the same questions and share similar designs. So I think all of these claims about these essential biological differences between men and women are overblown. Obviously, there are biological differences, but are there like male and female brains? I think that would be a gross oversimplification. And it's certainly just not the case that women are less rational or more emotional. Men can be super emotional. Hey, I'm an emotional guy. Like, I'll listen to music, or, you know, I love to laugh, right? I don't really get angry very often. I'm pretty chill that way, but I love to laugh, you know. In one of my old undergraduate apartments, I even had the live, laugh, love thing on the wall. I didn't put it there, but I didn't take it down either, you know, because I was such a happy guy. Yeah, Stefan, that's true. Bad statistics is a problem. Well, you can't do the statistics you need to do when you have such a tiny sample size, right? Those tools don't work. Those tools are meant for you to have, you know, if you're going to run a certain statistical test on your data, you need to have enough data. The test is designed to work on a sample size of such and such a size, right? So yeah, you're right. So yeah, I think we can all agree that all in all, there are of course differences, but yeah, or fiddle with the confidence interval. Yeah, this is called p hacking. When you fiddle with your confidence intervals or your p-value, you just kind of tweak things to sort of exaggerate your findings. And it ranges from just maybe using a different confidence interval or a different p-value. You know, maybe your results are non-significant at p.001, so you change to p.01 or 0.05, and then it becomes statistically significant, and then you publish. That's p hacking. So it can be something as benign as that, or it could be, you know, downright making up data. People have been caught doing that, just falsifying data. But we can all agree that I think men are emotional as well as rational, and women are rational as well as emotional. I mean, for goodness sake, we're both like this, but perhaps in different ways. And whether those ways in which we are different are completely due to biology, I think is doubtful. There is a massive interplay between biology, environment, and culture. And although that's not quite what the postmodernists mean by social construction, that's kind of how I think of it. There's a very complicated interplay when people are developing between biology, environment, and society, and technology for that matter, and that affects who we become. So feminists have critiqued studies from sociobiology too, and evolutionary psychology that make claims about women's supposed deficits in reasoning and abstract thought. I think many of these are just so stories, especially from evolutionary psychology. I read a paper once in my neuroscience class, for example, that examined gender differences in making aesthetic judgments, because I was interested in the uncanny valley phenomenon. The uncanny valley phenomenon is that is the phenomenon where human-like artifacts look very creepy if they're too realistic. So think about like bad CGI that looks strange, or wax figures look kind of weird. Humanoid robots look weird. That's the uncanny valley. And I was curious if there were gender differences in susceptibility to that. I thought maybe this could be a future avenue of research. I didn't do it, but I thought, hey, I've got to kind of explore my options. And I wanted to read about the neuroscience of aesthetics. Aesthetics is the area of philosophy that deals with beauty. And I thought maybe if I could find something on beauty, I could find something on ugliness and horror and things that are scary. It might help inform my research. And the only paper I could find was this thing that claimed to have identified differences in men and women in their judgments of natural beauty. So beautiful landscapes, and they found that women, there were gender differences, which they explained like with a Just So story. The story in particular was, oh, well, men would have been hunting, but women were gathering. We've encountered this theory before, right? And so women needed a better eye for beauty so that they could gather the best like fruits and nuts. Like this is a Just So story. Let's clarify, what is a Just So story? Does anybody know? Ah, there goes my phone. A Just So story is kind of like where, yeah, it just happens to be like, oh, let's just assume that in the past women really were exclusively gathering fruits and nuts and berries and things, and men were exclusively hunting. Let's just assume that. Well, then it would have, oh, well, it just would have turned out that women would have evolved an eye for beauty that outstrips a man's eye for beauty. Like, really? I mean, we know, and we discussed this before, that when we look at contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, they actually tend to be more egalitarian than you'd think. A lot of large hunts are rare, and men and women both gather, especially in coastal communities where men and women might fish. There are certain traditional fishing methods where a whole village might get together and corral fish into a lagoon and have a giant feast. The whole village helps out, right? Even later on, when we get past hunting and gathering, once we've got agriculture, once we have metallurgy, it was common for an entire village, men, women, and children, to all come out and work the blacksmith's billows so that the blacksmith could make metalwork, right? So yeah, problematic assumptions here and Just So stories. I guess the simplest example of a Just So story is like, why are berries red? Or why do they taste bitter? Well, bitter things are bad for us. You have to go beyond that. You can't just say, oh, it just turned out to be that way. You have to provide a causal mechanism. Anyway, I don't want to run out of time, so we better continue. So in summary of feminist empiricism, Dusek writes, feminist empiricists believe that an honest and accurate use of traditional scientific methods will undermine biases against women in science and technology. As feminist empiricism exposes more and more bias in the descriptions of human and animal behavior, one is led to question the extent to which the scientific method traditionally applied is sufficient to expunge sexist bias. If the leading peer-reviewed journal Science can publish an article on transvestitism among hanging flies, even though the insects do not wear clothes, one wonders whether traditional peer review can function to correct for bias. I think that's one of the funniest quotes from Dusek in this entire book, but he's got a very good point. Are the mechanisms of science good enough to correct these? Oh, for goodness sake. Sorry, everyone. are these mechanisms good enough to correct for bias against women, bad science, or underrepresentation? Well, maybe not, because if the sexism is so baked into it, and that's, maybe we need to change the system, and maybe the radical feminists are right. We need to dismantle the patriarchy in science instead, right? I think there's a bit of both, to be honest. But that's what the point is here about this. How can you publish an article on transvestitism, which is, we don't really use that word very, very much anymore, but transvestitism is just what psychologists would call a paraphilia, right? It's not the same as, I guess it could be a way. I mean, this is so complicated. This really is complicated. I guess it depends what you mean. Like, is a drag queen practicing transvestitism? I suppose, in a sense, but not in a paraphilic sense. A paraphilia is what a psychologist would call a kink. So I guess sometimes it's gender expression and sometimes it's paraphilia. But the point is, it's something humans do, not flies, because flies don't wear clothes. So if you can do this, if the journal Science can publish an article on transvestitism in a species of insect, then maybe we should question whether peer review is enough to get us around this gender bias. Although, this was done in the 70s. See, just you can see here. This was published in 1979. So that's a while ago. Things have changed. Things are a lot more inclusive and understanding now. I was watching, what was it? Our Planet? I think it was Our Planet. It was a documentary, or maybe it was about the oceans. Anyway, it talked about cuttlefish. And cuttlefish are really neat. They're related to squids and octopi, and they have the ability to change color and camouflage and blend in. And when they mate, the older male cuttlefish, they're really big. They get all the ladies because they're so big. Smaller males can't compete with them to attract a mate. So what do? They disguise themselves as ladies. And the word that was used in the documentary was drag. The drag cuttlefish. The cuttlefish goes into drag. The smaller male can't get close to the female because the female's hanging out with the larger male, but the larger male will welcome other female cuttlefish. So what does the smaller male do? He changes his color so he looks like a female, sneaks in, and he's able to mate with the other females, and then he gets out of there and changes color and looks like a small male again. Fascinating. It's clever cuttlefish. And I just thought that was a lot more nice and inclusive to describe the cuttlefish as getting into drag, as opposed to using a term like transvestitism. So that's cool. Let's go on. Come on now. There we go. Oh, for goodness sake, this computer. Okay, here we go. Other feminist approaches, Dusek writes on page 150, claim that more substantial changes in our usual accounts of science and technology are needed. Feminist standpoint theory is a more radical approach. The structure of the theory is based on an aspect of Marxist theory. I'm probably going to butcher this. Jorge Lucas claimed in his early work that the standpoint of the worker, central to the process of industrial production, but also oppressed and alienated, gave a privileged access to knowledge denied to the comfortable and detached capitalist owner. The owner, as self-conscious commodity, had direct personal insight into reification of the self that the capitalist or professional did not. Feminist standpoint theory makes a similar claim for the position of women as central to society's reproduction, but oppressed. What does this boil down to? Basically, that women, as an oppressed group, have better knowledge of the biases and of the oppression in the system than men do, because men don't encounter it. Men might be told about it, men might be like, oh yeah, there's a gender pay gap. I've heard about the gender pay gap. But a woman who's being paid less for doing the same job as a man knows the gender pay gap, right? So that's what that means. That's what standpoint theory implies. Standpoint theory here might entail that from the standpoint of women scientists and technologists, they know the group. So maybe we should listen to their standpoint to change science and technology and make these fields more inclusive. Thoughts? No thoughts. That's okay. I think again, I don't know too much about Marxism, but oh, someone's microphone is on. No problem. Yeah, I'm not too familiar with Marxism. I'm no expert. I know the basics, but seems to be something to this standpoint theory. Because even though I can't really get into that standpoint of women as an oppressed group in science and technology, or as a group that's, if not oppressed, underrepresented. I certainly can understand the workers' perspective. Let's continue. I think somebody's microphone is on. Yeah. Okay, it's gone now. Some feminists argue, as do many eco-feminists and feminist participants in disarmament or anti-nuclear movements, that women's nature, including their involvement in childbearing and child rearing, makes them more apt than men to be concerned with the existence of future generations and the preservation of the planet. On a broader scale, feminists committed to the notion of a woman's nature, as well as eco-feminists in general, claim that women are closer to nature. And there's some variation in, I guess you want to call, the roots of this claim. Some people who make this claim are perhaps a bit more essentialist and say that this really is due to males and females' nature. So women have an essential nature that makes them closer to nature. Others say it's more to do with power dynamics, which are a result of maybe social constructions, right? But both camps agree that patriarchy is connected to the male domination of nature. So patriarchy, or rule by the men, right? Power structures built by men for men. That's the patriarchy. Both camps see patriarchy as the ultimate problem, but disagree on its roots. It could be that men are essentially patriarchal. Maybe we're more like, as human beings, we're apes, right? And when we look at our ape cousins, it makes me wonder, what would our ancient ancestors have been like, and what would the biology and society of early, like super early human hunter-gatherers would have been like? What would that have been like? Look at chimpanzees, for example. 99 whatever percent the same as us, genetically speaking. Aggressive, patriarchal. This is the common chimp, by the way. You could definitely make a claim, I think, a defensible claim, that chimps are essentially violent. They're run by males. They go to war against other troops of chimpanzees. They will commit cannibalism. They'll kill other monkeys too. They like to eat meat. Chimpanzees are violent. Like, they're violent. But Then you've got your bonobo chimps. Bonobo chimps are kind of like hippies. I think of them as like hippies. Yeah, Vincente. Yeah, exactly. The bonobos are matriarchal. They don't go to war with other troops. In fact, they exist quite peacefully with other troops of bonobos. They'll get together and meet up and hang out. And their social currency is sex. So when they're meeting up with these other troops, they're making friends. They're you know, having a time. They're having a great old time. No war. Make love, not war. That is the bonobos' life philosophy, the way I see it. That's why I think of them as the hippies of the ape world. But chimps are violent and patriarchal. We're equally related to both of these species. I wonder what our early ancestors were like. Were we more like chimps, or were we more like bonobos? Could we ever know? I don't know, but it's fun to think about. Okay, let's move on. Just a question in the chat. Is megalomania associated with chimp traits? Maybe. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's not like no violence ever happens. But when violence within a troop or between troop does happen, usually it's from a young male, and the older females will get together and kind of like stop it, you know? So apes are fascinating, and we're apes, so we could learn a lot from the other great apes. So are we really closer to nature essentially, or is this really just a power dynamic that we've created for ourselves, a social construction, as it were? We don't know. But the tendency here seems to be to see male nature as, to quote from the poem that opens the chapter, to murder, to dissect. And you know, like, think of Aristotle. Aristotle was the first zoologist. You know, he was a philosopher, but a philosopher in like the old school sense. He was into everything. Aristotle studied everything. A Renaissance man well before the Renaissance. But, you know, Aristotle really liked vivisecting things. Vivisection is when you dissect an animal while it's still alive, because he liked to see how the organs worked. So murder, to dissect. Yeah, Aristotle right there. It's also argued that women are more respectful of natural systems and that they're more cooperative. Again, whether this is to do with some essential nature or not is up for debate. But whether you think it's due to essential biological features or a social construction, or somewhere in the middle, an interaction between biology, environment, and society and culture, wherever you sit there, some thinkers would say that this is ironic, saying that women are better suited to be stewards of nature or closer to nature because of their own nature, because they're essentialist claims, and they mirror the same claims that sociobiologists and biological determinists make, right? The very same people who say that women are unsuited for science and technology because of an essential nature, some kind of essential gender difference, being more emotional and less reasonable, to use the shop-worn example, right? So it seems that maybe the only difference in approaches here is how the essentialist traits, if they are essential, are valued. Ecofeminists might say, they might be gender essentialists and say, yes, women are natural caretakers, right? So they'd be better at saving the planet from technology. But others would say that, well, women aren't good at technology because they're not rational, they're emotional, they're meant to be caretakers. So the essential traits are still there. The only difference seems to be how they're valued. I don't know. What do you think? I think we need to try and avoid essentialism. because usually we get, even if there are essential traits, they're usually more complicated than we think, and we often oversimplify things, get things wrong. I mean, women as caretakers, I mean, yeah, sure, if you have a child, you're going to take care of it, but especially in early human societies, we talked about this before, there's this thing called alloparental care. I talked about this when I was mentioning the gay uncle hypothesis. An alloparent is somebody who's related to you and your offspring, but it's not their offspring. So, you know, your aunts, uncles, maybe older children, these are alloparents. And, you know, the saying, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, that's alloparental care. And men and women both did it, and still do in hunter-gatherer societies and in developed Western society, right? People with children leave them with relatives or friends. We have babysitters. We do this all the time, right? So I don't know. I think we need to try and be careful of essentialism. And if essentialism were true, yeah, I know this is complicated. This is tricky. I don't know. What does everybody think? So Vicente disagrees that with essentialism. Umay says maybe it's also important to consider the scale to which an essential trait could be applied. Like someone may have more comfortable with being a caretaker than others. Yeah. Yeah, like it sounds to me like what you're saying there is that there are lots of individual differences. So what is an essential trait? Like, is it true that women have the essential trait at being good at caretaking as a group? Well, even if that's true, there are women who do not want children, right? There are women who are like, ugh, get that baby away from me. And there are men who are like, oh, I love little kids, you know, like they're male kindergarten teachers. They love kids, right? So I don't know. I think that if there are essential natures, they're way more complicated than we usually think they are. And they interact with the environment, the physical and social environment too. So complicated that we may as well just dispense with the idea. But yeah, Julian, I think you hit the nail on the head right here. And this is kind of why I was like, I don't know what to say. It's like I can't make a value judgment on this essential traits without feeling like I'm being sexist, right? If I say that women are bad at technology because they're less rational, well, I just don't believe that, first of all. And second of all, like, that's pretty sexist. We know that there's no biological basis for any of those claims that women are less rational. There's just no biological basis for it. Women pick up language earlier. Women tend to have higher average IQ scores. I mean, hell, you can make the argument that it's men who are the dumb ones, really. If you wanted to look at the biology, I think that's kind of where some of the biology might take you. You know what I mean? So yeah, and if they're valued positively, well, then I just feel like I'm watching that refrigerator commercial then, like, oh, the refrigerator for today's modern woman. Make all those boys are hungry for the snacks, you know, go in the refrigerator, mom. I don't know why I'm talking like that, but yeah, like or that other commercial where it was showing, oh, look at how impressive it is that this housewife has to do all of this housework, and it's so like, wow, look at all that. but it's still like so sexist at the same time. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I drop these commercials in the Discord server. You've really got to watch them. They're weird, but it's important to know, you know, there's a history of this. Okay, now let's see if I can get going here. Slow computer. There we go. Postmodernism. I'm no expert on postmodernism, but I'll try to do my best to do it justice. Dusek writes, opposed to the theory of women's nature are postmodernist feminism and the anti-essentialist claim that gender is socially constructed. Postmodernism is a diverse movement of the last decades of the 20th century that, among other things, denies that there is a possibility of a complete system of knowledge or a metaphysical account of ultimate reality. You can go back and look at chapter 6 if you'd like to read, sort of refresh yourself. Postmodernism would deny that feminist standpoint theory would lay claim to the possession of the true standpoint. That's because postmodernism implies, you know, here where what Dusek says about the possibility of a complete system of knowledge or metaphysical account of ultimate reality. I call those meta-narratives, following a few other thinkers on the continental side. Narratives about narratives, theories of everything, like the theory of everything in physics would be like the ultimate meta-narrative. Postmodernism is skeptical that we would ever be able to pull anything like that off. There's no ultimate reality. There's no true reality. It's just the world as it's experienced or as it's talked about or thought about. There's no self. The unified and continuous self is an illusion. I like that one, actually. I'm not a postmodernist. I think we can have narratives and meta-narratives. But I'm a bundle theorist, which means I don't think the self is a unified entity that continues to exist. I think the self is actually a lot more like a process that unfolds. So the self isn't a thing, it's a process. That's the way I like to think about it. Stefan says, so the difference seems to be whether reality is centralized or decentralized in its design. Yeah, I mean, I would put it a little differently. I would say that, you know, different kinds of realism. Excuse me. Not political realism, but like realism about certain things is the opposite of postmodernism. So centralized or decentralized, I would say objective or subjective. Postmodernism is radically subjective, even though it denies that there's a unitary self. There's no essences, no essential natures. It's all social construction, right? So that's the way I would put it. Tess, those comparing average group or comparing group averages studies can sometimes be fun to talk about with people who understand basic stats and the true extent meanings of claims being made, which is to say almost no one. That's a good point. Yeah. Sometimes, I mean, I've been seeing this a lot, or rather not this exact thing, but discussion on the part of people who lack an understanding of basic stats. I guess what I'm about to say is by way of saying that, like, yeah, sometimes you read a paper and it sounds very fancy and complicated, but what's actually been found is just kind of like, oh, okay. It's not really all that profound, but you can make it sound profound with statistics if you know the right statistics. But you can also get things really, really, really wrong if you don't know them. Like a lot of misinformation I find on, say, social media. If I'm on Facebook or Twitter, I try to stay off Facebook. I doom scroll on Twitter a lot, though, when I'm not tweeting about Star Trek or something. Trek Twitter is actually pretty sick. But anyway, so okay, what was I talking about? We have misinformation, anti-vaccine misinformation, and they'll link to a study saying this study found this about the ineffectiveness of masks or this vaccine or blah, blah, blah. And I go and read the study, and the only thing I can think is that either they have absolutely no idea about statistics or they didn't read the study, because oftentimes the evidence they link me to is claiming the exact opposite of what they're claiming with their misinformation posts. So I don't know. That's kind of like, I guess that's just tangentially related to what Tess mentioned. But yeah. Also, what are averages? What is normal, right? That sounds pretty postmodernist, but yeah, like what is that? Donna Haraway, good. Donna Haraway is an interesting thinker. She's a postmodern feminist, Dusek writes, who has greatly contributed to the construal of science and technology. In her primate visions, she shows how the interplay of gender and race manifests the portrayal of the great apes in science and in popular discourse. Think here of movies like Planet of the Apes or like Jane Goodall, right? In her manifesto for cyborgs, she develops the category of the cyborg, a combination of human and machine, to undermine the dualities of the human and the mechanical, and to reject the notion of a human essence. So, in cybernetics, a cyborg is anything cybernetic involves the use of feedback. So in early cybernetics, we're actually not talking about what you think we're talking about at all. We're not talking about human robot hybrids. We're talking about watt governors and steam engines and gyroscopes. Kind of interesting stuff, really. But so a cybernetic organism or a cyborg would have this technology in their body. But Haraway is talking about a sort of more of like a metaphorical cyborg, trying to break that binary, right? Another thing that postmodernists, by the way, are big fans of is deconstruction, which I think comes through Derrida by way of Heidegger. Heidegger had this notion of destruction, taking systems apart to understand them. He didn't mean like destruction as in destroy, but like destructuring them. Derrida kind of steals this idea, calls it deconstruction, and now it's all over the place in postmodern philosophy. The idea is that there are binaries, and we need to deconstruct them because they don't accurately reflect reality. And there is no reality, really, if you're like an extreme postmodernist. And I think the greatest example that everybody's going to be probably the most familiar with because of popular discourse on the topic is like gender binaries, right? Deconstructing like the male-female binary, right? That is probably an example that a lot of people will be familiar with because there's a lot of public discussion, surrounding like trans and non-binary people nowadays. So, and a lot of them are social constructivists about gender, maybe not like super extremely. But I do know of like, for example, some trans YouTubers that are like, I would say that they advocate a sort of social constructionism, but it's not super radical. It's kind of like what I was saying earlier. I'm not trying to put words in anybody's mouth here, but it sounds to me like what I was saying earlier, where there's such a complicated interplay between biology, society, the environment, and technology that sure, maybe studying essential natures, if there are any, it is not going to be super helpful. But at the same time, I do think that there are real things out there. There are truths that we can know. So I'm not like a postmodernist, but I'm also not like, I don't know what the opposite would be really, but anyway. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that Haraway has got this category of the cyborg to undermine this human machine binary. And if you want to read, like, I know I'm always talking about Andy Clark, but he's got a cog-sci kind of take on this, where he talks about cognitive technology, how we're natural born cyborgs, right? He's actually got a book entitled that. More recently, Haraway's also talked about companion animals to blur these distinctions, right? I think this is the last slide, and we'll try and get through it quickly. Just to continue, Haraway's use of cyborgs to erase the traditional boundaries that humanism and essentialism have erected is similar in many respects to Bruno Latour's use of technology, human hybrids, or quasi-objects to undermine the opposition between traditional positivist objectivism and social constructivism. So there's a lot of potential opposites of postmodernism there. I guess I tend to kind of fall in with the humanism side of things, and I don't know if I'm a positivist or not. Positivism is a bit too simple. Anyway, I better not worry about what my worldview is while I'm teaching class. It's too distracting. Another example of these, of a blur, of just a blur between human and non-human, and technology and non-technology, is the example of dolphins. Dusek talks about a book called Cosmo Dolphins here, which I think is based in Heideggerian philosophy. And he draws attention to the fact that dolphins are interesting to both scientists and to like new age quasi-religious people. Dolphins, for example, are seen by scientists as one way that we might communicate with non-human life. Like, if we want to communicate with aliens, if there are aliens out there, well, why don't we try communicating with dolphins first, if they have language? Because they're kind of like alien to us. But there's also this quasi-religious like spirituality that surrounds dolphins. Like dolphins are magical or something, right? And sometimes even this binary gets destroyed. And I'm not going to go too deep into this, but I laughed out loud the first time I read this. Sometimes the scientists become the new age believers. So how's that for deconstructing your binaries? Dusek writes, the experiments of neuroscientist John C. Lilly started as traditional, cruel, constraining, and invasive neurophysiologic probes. He's doing this on dolphins, the poor dolphins. But led Lilly to believe he was actually speaking with dolphins. Lilly himself moved to sensory deprivation tank immersion and LSD to attempt to achieve dolphin-like consciousness. Okay, his experiments received favorable popular attention worldwide, and many non-scientists today believe that human-dolphin conversation has been achieved. Now, was it studying dolphins that caused this shift? No. I think it was probably the LSD. LSD and other psychedelics can certainly cause changes in personality, and some of these changes can be quite radical. Scientists in the 60s, some of them, after experimenting with psychedelic drugs like LSD, went to India and became like gurus, spiritual teachers. So John Lilly started as like kind of a cold, cruel scientist and turned into something of a hippie who believed that he had communicated with dolphins and achieved dolphin-like consciousness. I suppose that this is kind of like cyborgy in a sense. It all really has to do, I suppose, a little bit with transhumanism and posthumanism. The idea that we can transcend our biological limitations, merge with machines, and take control of our own evolution. Although transhumanism is a bit of a fringe movement, so I'm just saying. Okay, that's all I have today. I would have liked to have spent more time discussing that last section, the last part of the last section on the dolphins, because it was just so nutty. I mean, dolphins really are cool, and I think they probably do have some kind of dolphin language. They have names, for goodness sake. They call each other names, you know, dolphins. Like, wow, so cool. But can I achieve dolphin consciousness by taking acid and dunking myself in a sensory deprivation tank? Well, I'll do something to my consciousness. I don't know if it's going to be dolphin consciousness, but Timothy Leary, yeah. Timothy Leary was one of these early Harvard scientists who was into acid and magic mushrooms. And yeah, you know, we had Timothy Leary. Then after that, we had Terence McKenna. Nowadays, we got Paul Stamets. All really interesting people. But Timothy Leary, I've never read this book. I just kind of know about him peripherally. I know that he was a serious scientist. I think that Terence McKenna, who came a bit later, was a little bit too big of a hippie. He sounds like John C. Lilly sometimes. When I read about Terence McKenna, it sounds like I'm reading the exploits of an LSD taking, dolphin mind melding, sensory deprivation tank dunking person. Oh, it's a video. You know, I will have to look at this. Let me get back to you on this. Anyway, people are leaving. Class is over, but maybe I'll talk about this. I have another class tomorrow where I'm teaching about altered states of consciousness. And those go on YouTube. So tune in if you want, if you want. But next time we're going to start covering anti-technology. Okay, so thanks everyone for dropping by today. I'm sorry that I didn't get to talk about dolphins and acid for much longer, but I've already taken too much time. But I'm glad we got to finish off that section. So bye everyone, and see you next week. All right. Bye everyone.